Don't forget to like and subscribe. I used to live in a small town in Colorado, nestled in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. It was a quiet place, the kind where most businesses shut down by 9 p.m. But I worked the night shift at a roadside diner just off the main highway. I was 28 years old and had been waitressing there for a couple of years. The diner closed at 2 a.m., which was late considering how remote the area was. But given its location, there were usually at least a couple of customers hanging around until closing. Having grown up in Texas before moving to Colorado, I immediately noticed the cultural differences. Back home, people were talkative, engaging in long conversations even with strangers. Here, people were polite but reserved, keeping mostly to themselves. I had worked in diners before, but the customers in Colorado were different. They ordered, ate, paid, and left with minimal chit-chat, which suited me just fine. One night, close to 2 a.m., the kitchen had already taken last call when a single man walked in. He was slightly overweight, wearing outdated high-waisted jeans, a gray shirt tucked into a brown jacket, and glasses that looked too big for his face. He had a thick, unkempt mustache. When I asked if he preferred the counter or a booth, he chose a booth. He smiled the whole time, so I smiled back, though something about him felt off. I handed him a menu and mentioned that the kitchen was closing soon. He barely glanced at it before ordering a black coffee and a plate of pancakes. He introduced himself as Greg. His order was simple, so I quickly relayed it to the cook, who rolled his eyes but got to work. I returned to the dining area, and Greg immediately waved me over. He asked if I was from the area and started complaining about the poor road conditions. I replied with a generic response about the harsh winters causing cracks and potholes. Then he started asking more personal questions. Where I lived, if I lived alone. I kept my answers vague, just enough to be polite without giving away too much. He claimed he had just moved to town and was still getting used to things. By the time his food was ready, I was drained from the forced conversation. I brought him his plate and went about cleaning up the diner. Since he was the last customer, I made it a point to stay behind the counter, giving him space while also making it clear I was ready to close up. When he finally finished, I dropped off his check before he could even ask for it, hoping he'd take the hint. He paid with a card and left without incident. As I grabbed my things and stepped outside, I noticed something strange. There were 3 cars in the lot. Mine, the cook's, and a third one I didn't recognize. It was an old silver sedan, maybe a 2006 model, parked near the highway. The windows were so dark I couldn't see if anyone was inside. I figured it might have been Greg's car and didn't think much of it. I got into my car and started my usual 20-minute drive home. About halfway there, my dashboard dinged, and a warning popped up. My tire pressure was dropping. I watched as my rear passenger tire went from 20 psi to 10 in seconds. Then my entire car started shaking. I had no choice but to pull over. I stepped out to check the damage, and sure enough, my tire was completely flat. Just as I was about to grab my phone, headlights appeared in the distance, approaching slowly before pulling over behind me. A familiar figure stepped out. Greg. He was wearing gloves now. My stomach turned. He walked up to my window and knocked lightly. "Amy, is that you?" "What a coincidence," he said with a grin. My heart started racing. I cracked my window just an inch and told him I had a flat tire. He offered to help, acting as if this was all some lucky chance encounter. I told him my boyfriend was on his way to help me, though that was a lie. The whole time, I discreetly dialed 911, placing the phone on my lap while trying to keep my voice normal. I said something like, "Yeah, I don't know how I got a flat, but my boyfriend will be here any minute." The operator on the other end stayed quiet, listening. Greg's expression changed. The fake smile disappeared, replaced by something unreadable. He walked around to the other side of my car, out of my view. I whispered into the phone, "This man slashed my tire. He's trying to get me out of my car. I'm on." Before I could finish, a loud crash shattered my driver's side window. Glass rained onto my lap as I screamed. Greg reached inside, grabbing my phone and hurling it into the darkness. Then, without another word, he sprinted back to his car, jumped in, and sped off. His tires screeched as he turned sharply onto another road and disappeared. I was shaking uncontrollably. Without my phone, I couldn't call for help again. I had no choice but to sit there and pray that Greg wouldn't come back. After what felt like forever, flashing red and blue lights appeared in the distance. I ran out of my car, waving my arms. When the first officer pulled up, I was sobbing. Soon, a second and third officer arrived. They found my phone, completely smashed. I described Greg in his car as best as I could, and they immediately put out an alert. One officer drove in the direction Greg had gone, while another helped change my tire. The kindness of those officers was the only thing that kept me from breaking down completely. One of them even followed me home to make sure I got there safely. A week later, I got a call from the officer handling the case. They had reviewed the diner's security footage and were still investigating. But as far as I know, Greg was never caught. I never returned to that diner. I wasn't willing to risk ever seeing him again. Story 2. I was working a late shift at Joe's Diner, a rundown place on the outskirts of Chicago. It was a stormy night, rain hammering against the windows so hard it sounded like someone was trying to break in. Nights like these meant fewer customers. Who would want to be out in this mess? I was expecting a slow night. It mostly was, until they walked in. A man and a woman. The man looked around 40, his hair slicked back, a shadow of stubble across his jaw. The woman, barely in her 20s, looked uneasy, like she was being dragged along. They both stared at me the moment they entered. Their eyes were unsettling, too focused, too calculating. I forced a smile and led them to a booth by the window. They took an unusually long time to order, whispering among themselves. When they finally did, the man started making conversation. I'm a naturally chatty person, so I went along with it. He asked basic questions at first. How long I'd work there, if I liked it. But then his questions got more personal. "Do you live alone?" he asked, his voice smooth yet chilling. I hesitated but answered truthfully. "Yeah, about 10 minutes north of here. Pretty quiet." I didn't think much of it at the time. Something about a man being with a woman makes you assume he's harmless. But she barely spoke. She barely looked at me. It nagged at me, but I pushed the feeling away. They eventually finished their meal, left a generous tip, and disappeared into the stormy night. An hour later, it was time to close up. I said goodbye to my coworkers, rushed through the rain, and drove home carefully, the storm making visibility near zero. As soon as I got to my apartment, I ran inside, locking the door behind me. I lived in a 3-unit house. My place was on the middle floor, with a stairwell leading to all 3 apartments. I noticed neither of my neighbors' cars were outside, meaning I was alone in the building. Then, the knocking started. It was frantic, almost desperate. I froze. It was nearly 1 a.m. Who could it be? I approached the door slowly, peering through the peephole. A girl stood there, drenched from head to toe, wearing a gray hoodie with the hood pulled low over her face. "Please," she begged, her voice muffled through the door. "Please let me in. I need to use a phone." My gut screamed at me, Something was wrong. Are you lost? I asked. She hesitated. A man is following me. I need help. That's when it clicked. It was her. The girl from the diner. My blood ran cold. Weren't you just at Joe's? I asked. She ignored the question. Instead, she turned sharply, looking down the street. Oh my God, he's coming, she screamed, pounding on my door now. I peeked through the peephole again. A tall figure emerged from the darkness, walking towards my house, slow and deliberate. My stomach dropped. It was him, the man from the diner. The girl stopped pounding and turned back to the man, her posture suddenly different. Calm, almost robotic. She tilted her head slightly. Go, she said. The man lunged for the door. I slammed it shut and locked it, my hands shaking. I backed away, expecting the banging to start, but there was only silence. No knocks, no footsteps, just the rain. It was almost worse. I ran up the stairs, desperate to wake one of my neighbors. I pounded on their doors, but no one answered. Then I remembered. I was alone. Their cars weren't outside. A creak sounded from the stairwell. My breath hitched. Someone was inside the building. I bolted to my apartment and locked the door behind me, then grabbed my phone. I hesitated before calling the police. Maybe they were gone. Maybe I was imagining things. But then, knock, knock, knock. I turned toward the stairwell door. The knocks were steady, deliberate. I swallowed hard, stepping closer. Who is it? I called out. No answer. Just another knock. I listed my neighbors' names. No response. If you don't say something, I'm calling the police. I shouted. A pause. Then a whisper, just barely audible through the wood. Your blood on me. I stumbled back, sprinted to my bedroom, and locked myself inside. My hands trembled as I dialed 911. The operator stayed on the line with me while I hid in my closet. Every creak in the house sent my heart racing. The 10 minutes before the police arrived felt like hours. When they finally knocked on my door, I was too scared to answer at first. But when I peeked through the window and saw their uniforms, I finally let them in. They searched the house and yard but found nothing. Just rain and empty streets. Before leaving, one of the officers advised me to stay somewhere else for a few nights. I didn't argue. I packed a bag and drove to my parents' house. The next day, I returned. Everything seemed normal until my upstairs neighbor knocked on my door. He pointed to something behind me. Scrawled across the stairwell door in marker were the words, "Thanks for the service, Beth." I felt sick. They knew my name. I couldn't stay there anymore. I moved to a new apartment within a month. I still don't know what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure. I don't answer the door after midnight anymore. Story 3. It was just past midnight at Eddie's Roadside Diner, a 24-hour joint sitting on the edge of a lonely highway in Montana. The kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee and pie, where drifters came and went without a trace. On a freezing November night, the diner was nearly empty. Just me, the cook, and an old man nursing his black coffee in the corner booth. Then, the doorbell jingled. A man stepped inside, shaking the snow off his coat. Something about him made the hairs on my arms stand up. He was tall, gaunt, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. His lips barely moved when he spoke. Coffee. Black. I nodded and poured him a cup. As I set it down in front of him, he didn't even acknowledge me. He just stared out the window, watching the snow fall in thick, suffocating waves. A few minutes later, the old man from the corner booth stood up, tossed a few bills on the table, and made his way toward the door. That's when the gaunt man finally moved. His hand shot out, grabbing the old man's wrist. "Hard. Stay," he whispered. The old man yanked his arm free, muttered something under his breath, and bolted outside. I watched him hurry to his rusted pickup, slam the door shut, and peel out of the lot, disappearing into the night. The gaunt man turned his head, locking eyes with me. His gaze was empty, hollow. "Storm's bad tonight," he murmured. "Wouldn't want to be out in it." I nodded slowly, my stomach twisting. Something about him unsettled me. Maybe it was the way he never blinked. Maybe it was the way his fingers twitched against the table. Or maybe it was because, when I looked out the window, I noticed something strange. There were no footprints in the snow where he had entered. The front door had opened. The bell had rung. But there were no tracks leading in from outside. I swallowed hard. "You been traveling long?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He smiled. It was a terrible, stretched thing. "Longer than you can imagine." The cook, a gruff man named Hank, came out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. He glanced at the gaunt man and frowned. Then, he walked over to me and whispered, "You feel that?" I nodded. I didn't know what I was feeling, but it wasn't right. The lights flickered. The air grew thick and heavy, like the weight of a coming storm pressing against the diner walls. The gaunt man lifted his coffee cup to his lips, but he never drank. Just stared, unblinking. A sudden gust of wind howled against the windows. The bell above the door jingled again, but no one had entered. The gaunt man finally spoke, his voice like dry leaves scraping against pavement. "They always run," he whispered, "but they never get far." I turned to look out the window. The old man's pickup was back in the lot, but the driver's seat was empty. The doors were wide open, and the snow beneath it was untouched. No footprints, no tire tracks. Like it had never moved at all. My breath hitched. My hands shook. I turned back to the gaunt man, but the booth was empty. The only thing left was his untouched cup of coffee, steam still rising from the surface. I stumbled back, knocking into Hank. "Did you see that?" I whispered, but he just shook his head. "See what?" I pointed to the empty booth. He was just there. Hank frowned. "Who?" I turned pale. "The man who just came in. He was right there, drinking coffee. He grabbed that old guy. You saw him." Hank's face went blank. "No one's been here except you and me, King. The place has been dead all night." I felt the room spin. The lights flickered again, and a sharp gust of wind rattled the windows. I turned back toward the booth, heart pounding, and then I saw it. The coffee cup was gone. In its place was something else, something small, dark, and glistening under the fluorescent lights. A single, blackened tooth. My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled backward as a whisper curled around me, though the voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once. "See you soon." The door swung open by itself. The wind howled louder, and the bell above the entrance jingled, like someone, had just walked out into the storm.